So as I started recording, I saw an article in the Atlantic that I haven't read yet, but it was talking about how the impossible might just become the possible. And usually when you see a headline like that, it's a good emblem of something, right? Like, oh, we're never going to be able to give everyone health care. It's impossible. Oh, wait, maybe it's going to be possible. Unfortunately, in this case, it's probably about Ukraine and how the impossible idea of a catastrophe might be becoming more and more possible. I'll read it and get back to you guys later in the week. But, anyways, I hope everyone's doing well today. Tuesday, State of the Union in a couple hours here. I don't know why, but I've had Tucker Carlson on in the background. It's always interesting to hear his thoughts. And, he's making this a big deal, a big rebuttal on Biden and how atrocious Biden's been. And I'm not a huge Biden guy, but maybe I'm not reading the same information he is, or I don't have the same agenda, but I don't think Biden's been that bad. I think he's more just been an unfortunate product of our division and COVID and now this crisis as well. So I don't really think this is Biden's fault, but maybe I'm wrong. Tomorrow I'm going to do an episode on the State of the Union, my thoughts on it, and the special election that happened today in Texas, and probably just a few other non-Ukraine things tomorrow. But today I just wanted to talk about just some updates, and then what the Chinese media is saying about Ukraine, an update on what could happen with Taiwan, and also just some other thoughts on Ukraine-China related issues. So first off, I just would say I'm pretty worried about what is next, I guess, if we wanted to just wrap up my general thoughts on this issue. As I started recording, I read that Chechnyan forces may be entering Ukraine to help track down Zelensky and his government. Again, from day one, it would have been easier for Putin and the Russians if they could have just toppled the Ukrainian government and put up a puppet government, right? Of course, nothing's gone to plan, as I talked about yesterday. But, Zelensky's really calling for help, and it's getting complicated on that front because I understand that he's begging for help. I would too. The Ukrainian people need help. But at the same time, as NATO members and as Americans, we need to understand that it's not as simple as just helping Ukraine right now. I've said that I do think we may need, there may be a time when we do need to do something, but it still isn't right now. And I know Zelensky is a hero and, he's really stood up strong for his people, but it doesn't mean we need to follow everything he says. And I hate to say that, but we can't just start escalating things at this point. But also, another thing that worries me, I guess that's what we'll call this segment, things that worry me. The first week was great for the Ukrainians in terms of giving their population hope. I think by Zelensky staying in Kyiv, it really gave them hope. But unfortunately, we do know that the Russians have more supplies, they have more troops, and they have more weapons. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, if you look at examples like Grozny and Aleppo, the Russians can level a city pretty quickly. And there's this 40-mile long convoy heading towards Kyiv, and I'm sure you guys have seen it. It's just ridiculous. And if they do circle the city and really decide to start hurting people, I do believe it could get bad quite quickly. Also, Russia, I believe it was late last night or maybe early today, they warned residents and civilians in Kyiv to leave. And this likely means, and I'm fairly sure, that they are saying anyone who is not leaving Kyiv is now an enemy combatant. And so, yes, they're giving people one last chance to leave the city, either escape to the west or join Russia, which is obviously not going to happen from what we've seen. And anyone left, they're now going to be collateral, And that probably tells me that Russia's getting ready to escalate their use of force, right? Also, I can't reiterate enough how it's clear that the Russians did not want to start causing mass casualties and mass damage and destruction, but they can. there's been several conflicts since 2000 or the late 90s that show us just how brutal the Russian aerial forces and ballistic systems and all their other forms of military power are. There's two examples I want to just touch over really quick because I hope they don't come true in this situation, but they actually just paint how atrocious Russia has been as an actor that's got a lot less coverage. There's Aleppo and Grozny. And let's start with Grozny. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't hear the name very much. I see it in print more often, but I think it's Grozny. Yeah. And so this was in the second, I think it was the second Chechnyan War, which happened from 99 to 2000. Remember, Chechnya is a state of Russia. There's been independence movements. There's also been loyalist separatists. Very similar to Ukraine in a lot of ways. Anyways, basically there was the Battle of Grozny, which was this just brutal siege and assault of the Chechnyan capital, which is Grozny. And it happened from, I think, late 99 to early 2000. And, I mean, the fighting just devastated the city, just completely destroyed it. I was looking just through some images while I was reading up on just some of the statistics on it. And, I mean, it looked just like a tragic series of events. Now, we have to remember that social media and the massive openness of the internet that we have today wasn't around even, 23 years ago, 22 years ago. And so I think a lot of people don't know about Grozny, unless obviously you're from that area, just because now everything's so visible. Hong Kong protesters, Taiwan, Ukraine right now, we see it all quite quickly. And that wasn't the case here. So that's why I think it's important to talk about what the Russians did in this example. In 2003, after this just bombardment and siege of Grozny, I don't know why I keep saying Grozny. Basically what happened is the United Nations called it the most destroyed city on earth, and between 5,000 and 8,000 civilians were killed during the siege, and that's just an estimate. Like, there's definitely a chance that it was a lot more, and it was actually the bloodiest episode of the Second Chechnyan War. And I guess the Russian tactic, from what I'm reading here, was to hold back tanks and armored personnel characters and just subject the Chechnyans to an intensive heavy artillery attack, aerial bombardment. And then as soon as they wiped out a lot of infrastructure, it turned into street-urban warfare. And, I mean, it sounded atrocious. I mean, I was too young at the time to really witness that or remember it. And again, it wasn't covered in the sense that our generation and the one below me are able to watch things. But from what I've gathered, it was atrocious. And Russia was capable of doing it then. Clearly, the world did not respond enough to that. So that's one example. Then we have Aleppo in Syria, which a little more recent, unfortunately. And I'm looking at an article here from Human Rights Watch that came out in 2016, and that was the period when Aleppo was just leveled in many parts of the city. Aleppo is one of the most historic cities in the world. So much architecture, so much history. I've heard that prior to the Syrian civil war and just the atrocities that Assad and Putin helped, and of course the U.S. was involved, and I can't condone that either, but I've just heard it was atrocious what happened to Aleppo. And so there was this Russian-Syrian coalition which committed war crimes basically during a month-long just bombing campaign of opposition. And if you're not watching, I'm putting up quotes here because it was opposition-controlled territory in Aleppo. From what I've read about the Syrian crisis in general, they were very liberal with their definition of opposition, and they were very liberal of bombing areas. And there's a Violations Documentation Center, which is a Syrian civil monitoring organization, and it documented that these bombings on terrorist parts of Aleppo killed more than 440 civilians, including about 100 children, and the airstrikes were usually indiscriminate. They were targeting mainly hospitals, and they were using cluster munitions, which just make casualties more likely the way that they are used. They're just, cluster munitions, clusters, right? I mean, everything's hit. And also incendiary weapons. And I was looking at some before and after pictures in this Human Rights Watch article, and I mean, some of the pictures before and after are just heartbreaking. So the reason I bring these two up is because we have Grozny and Aleppo. So the Russians clearly have the capability to do just indiscriminate bombing, and I really do worry that's what's next here, because they've given the warning. They've said leave Kyiv, and there's about 40 miles of Russian artillery, vehicles, etc., all heading towards Kyiv. So it's scary. Also, there's the growing push, I guess you could say growing push. I'm not pushing for it. I don't think most people are, but even Adam Kinzinger, who I'm a fan of on more domestic policy, he's even become supportive of a no-fly zone. Just for those who don't know, a no-fly zone would basically be telling all militaries and commercial airlines not to fly over Ukraine. Clearly, if you guys have seen maps online, not a lot of people are flying over Kyiv, especially like no one's flying over Kyiv or Ukraine for domestic or international flights. But it would be more basically telling the Russian military you cannot fly into Ukrainian airspace, and of course, we would also have to enforce it, right? If we're going to do a no-fly zone, you can't just say no-fly zone. You would also need to actually enforce it, and this would automatically be an act of war. Vox actually has a pretty good article here called the calls for a no-fly zone are worth taking seriously, and it says here in quotes, because of what they reveal about a widespread yet mistaken mindset among many of Americans' foreign policy elite. The people calling for intervention in Ukraine are stuck in the 90s, where American hyperpower was crucial, where it seemed as though the U.S. could impose its vision of global order at gunpoint virtually everywhere. The Ukraine war is one of the clearest demonstrations yet that this era is over, and a U.S. policy that refuses to recognize this reality could prove to be catastrophic. Russia has deployed something like 60% of its entire land forces to the Ukrainian theater. It does not want to fail. It is almost certain that they would not roll over and accept NATO control of the skies. Russian forces would fight back, and that would mean direct war between nuclear-armed powers. And I think that's a really good way to put it, is because clearly Putin is going all in. Again, I don't understand completely why. It pisses me off that he is, but he is completely going all in. And if we do a no-fly zone and start enforcing it, that means we're going to have aerial fights over Ukraine and an actual declaration of war between NATO allies and Russia. And we don't want any of that. So it's really reckless to be, I think, even talking about that. I will also add a few more things that worry me is that Putin has never lost a conflict. I talked about Chechnya. I talked about his aid in the Crimean crisis. He's quite arrogant and clearly delusional, and I worry that even if he's losing this one, he may do something very drastic so that history remembers him. He's all about the legacy, I think, at this point. I've read a lot of interesting articles about it where he really doesn't care about his people or the economy right now. It's about legacy. And if that is the case, especially, I've also heard reports that haven't been proven to be true or false, but there are people, Marco Rubio included, who do believe that maybe Putin is terminally ill. And if that is the case, that brings up a whole other conversation about why he's doing these things. But to me, it's more like a legacy issue here, and I do worry that the more entrenched his troops get, the worse it could be. Also, Ukraine has asked to join the EU. I don't know if you guys saw that. In theory, I like that idea. As someone who lived in the EU for a long time, I like the idea of the entire process, to be completely honest. Open, shared borders among states that have a shared common interest of democracy and liberal values. At the same time, if Ukraine joined the EU right now, it would probably be a direct act of war. Putin would probably consider it an act of war. One positive of that, I guess, is that it seems like the EU is really picking up where NATO can't do much without going to war. I like that the EU is actually really mobilized against Russia on this. Obviously, this is happening in the EU's backyard, and that is a positive, but I think it would be a little bit reckless to let Ukraine join the EU right now. And I honestly wish they could, but I just don't think it would be smart right now, I guess.